Hi everyone. Sorry, I'm not feeling great today, so it's not going to be a high energy presentation, but I did want to at least give you a little bit of a lecture on the content so that we could stay on track. And when we meet next week in class, we will be focused a lot on the project that's coming up. So you have a research article summary and also a presentation that's linked to that. So we're going to talk a lot more about that next time. So I didn't want to fall further behind. So I'm going to give you an abbreviated version of the lecture online. And then, of course, you'll have the readings to make sure you stay on up to speed. So for chapter 8, there's just a couple of concepts that I wanted to bring up, and then we'll spend a little bit more time on chapter 9. When you look at some of these contextual theories, I think it's really important that when we focus on the learning, that it's in context. So we spent the last couple of chapters talking about different learning strategies, but it's really critical for teachers to think about how to help students use that information when they encounter new situations. So sometimes we aren't always likely to transfer those skills, and we may need to provide some guidance to our students on how to do that and maybe even give them some practice at doing so. When we collaborate with others, we're much more likely to increase our learning because we're co-constructing that meaning. So when I have you work together with your partners in the reading assignments or the group project that you'll be doing a little bit later on this semester, it's a chance for you to really collaborate, work together, and assist one another at learning the skills. And again, hopefully in the context of something that has meaning and value to you. And as we have talked about before, there's a lot of benefits of working with others who are different from you. The research really has shown that there's a significant increase in critical thinking and obviously, just general interpersonal skills when you work with others who are different than you. So when we think about authentic assessments, it's assessments that are applied to real life. So, in the example shown here, you see the little kids are cooking. Well, you could have math lessons that are related to cooking. So instead of doing math in isolation, having to do problems that have to do with the recipe. That's really kind of, important for you to think about. And sorry about that. To think about ways that you can make it come alive for students. So you'll notice with the exam, the process that I am using is more case studies rather than just having you memorize information. Excuse me. And for the sake of rote memory, but really to be able to learn the content so that you can use it in a variety of situations. So when you're looking to assess your students, you're going to want to find ways where you can find, just kind of real world value to the assessments and to the lesson plans in general. All right, so chapter 9 is about behaviorism, and we're going to focus on how these concepts apply to learning. So these probably are not new to you. I'm assuming you've seen them before in your intro to psych days, but we'll focus on their application to the educational situation. Excuse me. So classical conditioning, I like to ensure that my students really understand this concept, and sometimes it can be a more challenging concept, but if you remember that conditioning means learning, that is kind of key to it. Then basically what we're saying in terms of classical conditioning is that you're learning through association. And you may recall the famous Pavlov's famous study with the dog and the meat powder, and what the dog discovered, actually Pavlov was not studying learning, he just kind of happened into noticing this observation, was that every time the bell rang, when the gate opened for the dog started to salivate even before the food or the meat powder was presented. So the dog began to learn that the bell was associated with the meat powder. So that connection between the two what was learned. That's classical conditioning. So here's just kind of an overview. So if conditioning means learning, then unconditioned means it wasn't learned. So before any conditioning happened, you would have the unconditioned stimulus, the not learned stimulus, which is the meat powder, and the dog had salivates normally. You don't have to teach a dog to salivate to the meat powder. So because that happens without any learning, that's called the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. And then they were pairing the bell, which initially was a neutral stimulus, and the neutral stimulus before learning happens resulted in absolutely no consequence. It was neutral, so the dog didn't do anything because it heard a bell. It didn't have any meaning or value to the dog. But then what happens next is conditioning took place. So the bell and the meat powder were paired, and this happened, multiple times. You can have conditioning happen just once. So for instance, if you get bit by a dog, and it was a pretty bad bite, you might only need that one connection to be kind of fearful of dogs. That would be conditioning. In fact, a lot of the phobias are conditioned. But in many cases, it's usually multiple pairings, like in this case. So after the multiple pairings, when the bell is, rung, it becomes now a conditioned stimulus. Why conditioned? Because it's a learned stimulus, because now it salivates, and this was a learned response or a conditioned response. So that's just kind of a quick recap on good old Pavlov. Now let's talk about it more in terms of the classroom. So there are a variety of ways that teachers use classical conditioning to help classes run smoothly. The first is sometimes linking fun with learning, because you want learning to be associated with having a good time. So sometimes that's where teachers will, integrate games and other things, because you want to evoke a positive feeling for students when they're learning. So you want them to associate, kind of a good feeling to learning new content and skills. Another powerful way to use classical conditioning is through using them for the purpose of transitions. So what that means is, here's an example. Like, I remember when I went into my son's kindergarten class, which was a really long time ago now, the teacher had this triangle and would go ding, ding, ding. It was very light, but the students all knew, and they associated that sound with it's time to go sit on my purple square. It's time to transition to the next activity. So you can help students kind of learn by association and facilitate some smooth transitions. And if you've done some observations in classrooms, you probably have seen that at play. All right. Another major type of learning is operant conditioning. So again, conditioning still means learning here, but operant conditioning, instead of learning by association, it's learning by consequence. And Skinner is the famous psychologist associated with operant conditioning, and Skinner had what was called the Skinner box. So basically, in this situation, you can see the little rat in the box, or sometimes there's pigeons or whatever it might be in our psychology experiments. Once the animal presses this little lever, food is given to the rat, and what do you think is going to happen? They're going to continue to press that so they can get more food. But if you instead put a electric shock as a result of pressing that, then the rat is going to quickly discover that that's a bad consequence and won't do that anymore. So basically what Skinner has shown is that we learn by consequences. Now, there are a couple of different kinds of consequences and different ways to either increase or decrease a behavior using the operant conditioning principles. So reinforcement is all about increasing behavior, and this is an area that sometimes students get tripped up on a little bit, but because there's positive and negative reinforcement. So don't think of positive and negative as being good and bad, but instead think of it in terms of math, like positive is adding and negative is taking away. Both of these reinforcements are trying to increase behavior, and you can do that through a good reinforcement. So giving a student a gold star for doing a good job, or even smiling at their contribution, or getting a good grade on a paper. That's going to make it more likely that they continue to do that activity. Whereas negative reinforcement is removing something bad. So a great example in education is the homework pass. Now, you and I don't think homework is bad. I hope you don't think homework is bad, but students sometimes do. So if you say, well, if you do your homework Monday to Thursday, I'll give you a homework pass on Friday, so you don't have to do your homework on Friday. So basically, you're removing something that they don't want to do, and the purpose is to increase the positive behavior of Monday to Thursday. Another great non-academic example is your car. Anytime you get in your car, you hear an annoying beep until you buckle up, and that is negative reinforcement, in action, because it's basically trying to increase your seatbelt usage by removing an annoying noise once you buckle up. Now, punishment, on the other hand, excuse me, is about decreasing a behavior. So certainly, we're not going to hit students, but as you can imagine, those kinds of actions would certainly reduce the behavior. But in a classroom setting, there is, unfortunately, thankfully, we're not seeing, the corporate punishment being used, but we often do see teachers yelling or embarrassing students. And that is certainly one way to decrease the behavior. If you get embarrassed, you're probably not going to do it again. But it is not what I would advocate for sure. Clearly, you want to try to rely on positive and negative reinforcement instead. And, there are terms out there of positive and negative reinforcement, but it really bothers me to use the word positive punishment. Let me say it right, positive and negative punishment, but it really bothers me to use that term positive punishment. So I don't like to think about it that way, but you can basically do the same thing, either add something like the yelling or the embarrassing, or remove something. Now, timeout is a type of punishment that can work. So you could, remove a student, young children, sometimes are just removed from a situation. Unfortunately, we often go to removing a recess or other things, and I'm not a big fan of that. Oftentimes it's so far removed from when the action happened that they may not even remember what that punishment is for. And I think that students, especially students who have trouble sitting for a long time, really need that opportunity to engage in recess. So again, I'm not a big fan of using the punishment approach, but it is important for you to see how those two different approaches to influencing behaviors can be utilized in the classroom. As you can imagine, there are many ethical issues with punishment. So you can't put a student in the corner. That's embarrassing to them. We have to think about their social emotional well-being as well. Obviously, we wouldn't have any hitting or anything else like that. So punishment is certainly problematic, and I'd like to see you rely instead on positive and negative reinforcement strategies. Now, how often do you have to reinforce? You're not going to be able to give students a positive consequence every single time they engage in a positive activity. So, understanding the difference between different kinds of schedules can help you recognize the fact that it's not necessary to give a student a positive consequence every single time they behave or do something that you're looking for them to do. So, the one that has the highest ratio of response rates is called variable ratio, and that's when it's unpredictable. And this one actually is the one that casinos use with the slot machines, so you never know whether the next time is going to be the time that you get kind of, the big winnings, so to speak. And in the classroom, it could be an unpredictable number of times. So hopefully you'll continue to engage in those behaviors in hopes of getting the positive consequence. Now, there are times when you might want to use a fixed approach, and you might even want to do that after every behavior in the beginning. If you're trying to help a student develop a behavior that they're not very good at, then you might want to do that in the beginning to get it rolling. And then once they've started to develop some skills in that area, you could shift over to, sorry, I keep bumping into these things trying to get this out of the way. And there we go again. So you can, again, maybe start with a fixed approach, so give them a positive consequence every time, and then transition over to one of the ratio ones after the skills have been developed. So here's some examples of using operant conditioning in the classroom. Focusing on positive reinforcements is really important, and as I just mentioned, you can start by reinforcing it a lot in the beginning and then shifting over to that unpredictable schedule once the behavior is established. It is important for the rewards to be meaningful, so if the prize is pizza and somebody doesn't like pizza, that's not going to do it for them. So you need to know your students and what matters to them, so that you can pick and choose your consequences appropriately. I also encourage you to use negative reinforcement to increase behavior. So the homework pass is a really great strategy, and thinking about some other ways to do that as well. And if you absolutely have to use punishment, as I said before, it needs to be pretty much immediately following. It should be brief, and it should be related to the behavior, so the consequence should match it. So taking recess away for someone not handing in their homework doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Maybe having them sit down with a teacher to do some homework, having to stay a few extra minutes could potentially have some more value, removing some of their free time later in the day, but I wouldn't necessarily take the recess away. Now, shaping is another important strategy here. It's about using reinforcement to get students to engage in a behavior that you want. So let's pretend you're in an elementary class, for instance, and you have a student who doesn't want to come and sit in circle time. So you're having some kind of activity, and they're all about running around the room. Well, what we want to do is reinforce their behavior as it gets closer and closer to what it is that you're looking for. If you wait until they sit down, you may never get to reinforce the behavior. So instead, you're going to want to think about what kinds of behaviors might, demonstrate they're moving in the right direction. So maybe they're playing with a toy off on the side, and they they glance over at the circle time. Well, then you might, give them some positive reinforcement. Could just be a smile back at them or something. And then if they come a little bit closer to circle time, then you might give them some more reinforcement. As they get closer and closer, they'll, get additional reinforcements. So the idea is that we could shape behaviors by using positive reinforcement. Okay, and then I think this is the last thing we're going to talk about, which is group consequences. So there are some teachers who like to use the everybody kind of, decides whether you're going to get a good or bad consequence. So as a class, if you all do the right thing, we're going to get a pizza party, and if not everybody does the right thing, then we're not. And as you can imagine, there's some pros and some cons associated with this. So for instance, the pros certainly could be that there's some positive peer pressure, and that might serve as a motivation and could elevate the behavior of others, and you might even be able to engage students in some cooperative and supportive behaviors to try to, hey, we're all the same team here, let's try to accomplish whatever the task is so that we can do well. But as you can imagine, if a student isn't doing what they want, they could quickly get rejected by their peers too. So this can backfire. So I do caution teachers who use this approach, and I think you need to know your students and your class to know whether it's going to function effectively or not. And I would never make it 100%, the way that you use behavior management in your class. All right, I'm going to stop there. I think I need to go rest again, but I wanted to at least give you at least a little bit of a lecture. So I'm so sorry again about not being there live today, but I hope this is a little bit helpful and can kind of keep us on track. We'll review all the reading assignments next time for all the chapters. I'll answer any questions that you have. In the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out via email if you have any questions for me. Otherwise, I will definitely see you next Monday. All right, take care. Bye-bye.